original creator and facilitator of our Farmington meeting in Yukon. Thank you very much, Bruce. He did that over 30 years ago. He later went to the University of Virginia as the Chester Carlson Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences. He's the author of over 100 scientific articles and books. And he's just published his new book, After, A Doctor Explores What Near-Death Experiences Reveal About Life and Beyond. Should be very interesting. The book is also available. It's available as a book or in an audio form. And to place an order, you simply, you can go to the original invitation you got from, from Bethany. And if you click on the title of the book, you'll see that there are many outlets and forms of his book. Dr. Greyson is a towering figure in research on death, the brain, and consciousness. He has consulted with the National Institute of Health, and he has addressed a symposium on consciousness at the United Nations and at the Dalai Lama's compound in India. Very, very impressive. I could go on, but we're tight on time. So please welcome Dr. Bruce Greyson.
Thank you, Jack. I must say it's good to see you after all these years. I don't know if anybody else is still left from those old days in the group. It tends to be a transient group, I guess. But it's good to be back again with you, even virtually. This has been a long, strange journey for me to near-death research. I started out in a very materialistic scientific household. My father was a chemist, and the world was defined by the periodic table of the elements. And if you couldn't see it or hear it or touch it, then it didn't exist as far as we were concerned. And there was just never any talk in our household about anything that was non-physical, let alone spiritual or religious. We weren't opposed to that. It's just that it never occurred to us that there was anything besides the material world. And that was fine with us. You know, I thought that was fine. It explained the world to me. And when you die, that's the end, and fine. So I went through college and medical school with that mindset that what you see is what you get, period. And I thought I was going to be a materialistic scientist like my father was. But he also instilled in me a strong belief in skepticism, which means you don't take anything at face value, you question everything. And that also includes, if you're a true skeptic, your own beliefs. So if you don't question your own beliefs, you're not really a skeptic. You're a believer in something. So I went through medical school, still thinking I was a materialist. And a few weeks into my internship in psychiatry, I was eating dinner in the cafeteria at the hospital, and the pager on my belt went off. And being a brand new intern, I was a little startled by this, so it startled me. And I dropped my fork and splashed some spaghetti on the book that I was reading. So I bent down to clean it off and realized there was a spaghetti sauce on my tie as well. So I wet the napkin and tried to clean it off, and I actually made it a little bigger than it was before. But I answered the page, and it was a patient in the emergency room who had overdosed, and I was supposed to go down and evaluate her as a psychiatric intern on call. So I didn't want to take the time to try to change my tie, so I just put on a lab coat, a white lab coat, and buttoned it up so no one could see the tie. And then I went down to the emergency room and saw the patient. Well, she was totally unconscious. I called her name, I moved her around, her arms around, could not arouse her at all. She was totally out. However, her roommate, who had brought her in, was waiting down the hall, about 50 yards down the hall in another room for me to talk to. So I went down to the other room, talked to the roommate, found out what was going on in the patient's life, what stressors she had, what she might have taken as an overdose. Talked to her for about 15 minutes, and then during that time, it was very hot in there. This is Virginia in the summer in the 1970s with no air conditioning. It was very, very hot in there. So I started sweating, and I ended up unbuttoning my lab coat so I wouldn't sweat so much, exposing the tie. I didn't realize that I was just talking to the roommate. So we talked for about 15 minutes and then finished. And I stood up to shake her hand and send her on her way, and saw that the tie was then exposed again. So I quickly buttoned it up again, so no one in the ER staff would see it. She left. I went back to the patient's room, and the patient was still out cold. So I talked to the medical intern who would admitted her to the ER, and he said he was going to admit her to the intensive care unit overnight just to make sure she was okay. And I arranged to come back in the morning to the ICU to see her. So I did that. I went back to the on-call room to take a nap for a few hours and came back in the morning and went to the intensive care unit where she was finally awake, but very, very drowsy. I went into her room, touched her arm to make sure she was still awake, and she kind of stirred a little, didn't open her eyes. And I said, Holly, I'm Dr. Greyson, I'm from psychiatry. And she opened one eye and said, I know who you are. I remember you from last night. Well, that kind of stunned me because I thought she was out cold the night before. So I said that to her. I said, Holly, I'm not surprised. I thought you were asleep when I saw you last night. And she opened both eyes then and said to me, not in my room. I saw you talking to my roommate. Well, that made no sense to me at all. I couldn't imagine what she was talking about. So I said, you mean the nurses told you I talked to your roommate? And she said, no, I saw you. That blew me away. I couldn't imagine how that could happen. It could only have happened if she had left her body and come down to the other room with me. And that, how can you do that? As far as I could tell, I was my body. She could see my confusion. So then she told me about the conversation I had with her roommate, where we were sitting, how the room was laid out, everything we said to each other. And then she said, and you had a striped tie on with a red stain on it. She could not possibly have known that. Nobody knew that except her roommate, who had gone back to the dorm and hadn't seen her again. I was just blown away. I couldn't imagine how this could be. But I couldn't deal with my own confusion. My job was to help her with hers. So I had to kind of stuff my feelings down for a while and talk with her about why she attempted suicide, what was going on in her life, and so forth. And then left the room and tried to basically stop thinking about this. I thought about it, thought maybe she's playing a trick on me somehow. I couldn't figure out how. I don't know how it happened, but it just couldn't be true. These things don't happen. It was a few months later that a patient was admitted to the hospital after he shot himself in the head. This is a middle-aged man, a farmer, who had lost both his parents, and he was feeling despondent without them. And he started drinking heavily, and eventually, after several months of brooding about being alone, he decided he was going to end his life. So he got his hunting rifle out, went to the cemetery where his parents were buried, laid down on their grave, positioned the gun under his chin, and pulled the trigger. He blew the right side of his head off, but somehow miraculously missed his brain. A gravedigger happened to be in the cemetery at the time, saw this happen, came rushing over to him where his head was in a pool of blood, wrapped his head up in cloth, threw him in a truck, and drove him to the hospital. He was admitted to the plastic surgery service where they reconstructed that side of his face. And after a week or two, he was transferred to the psychiatric unit, where I was his intern. When I first saw him, I expected to see someone who was very sad, very depressed. That was not the case at all. He was actually fairly cheerful and not suicidal in the least. So I asked him, what happened? He told me that after he pulled the trigger, the cemetery disappeared, and he found himself in a lush field of flowers, beautiful music, birds around, and then he saw his parents slowly walking towards him. And when they saw him, they got very excited. He heard his mother say to his father, "Look, here comes Henry." As they got closer, his mother looked at him and said, "Oh, Henry, now look what you've done." And then the scene ended and he was back in the cemetery, having this gravedigger wrap his head up and putting him in the truck. I asked him what he made of this, and he said, well, now that I know where my parents are, I'm not worried about them anymore. I can get back to my life because I know I'll join them someday. And he was quite happy. In fact, he was so relieved at knowing that his parents were well that he started trying to counsel other patients on the psychiatric unit about how they should not be suicidal. This also made no sense to me at all. His parents were dead. How could he have seen them? He obviously was hallucinating this, whether it was part of his grief, he'd been drinking, was he hallucinating from the alcohol? I just couldn't imagine how it happened. It was about 4 or 5 years later that Raymond Moody joined me at the University of Virginia. Shortly after he'd written his book called Life After Life in 1975, in which he gave us the term near-death experience and described for us what these experiences were like. Before that, no one had a name for these experiences, and not very many doctors have ever heard of them. And I read his book, and in talking with him, I realized for the first time that these things my patients were telling me were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a large phenomenon that millions of people all over the world were having, not just psychiatric patients, but everybody. Well, I couldn't imagine how this could be, but as a scientist, I couldn't deny that these things were happening. And therefore, it was my responsibility to try to understand them. Trying to push it out of my mind, trying to deny that they existed, seemed somehow dishonest. I thought, as a skeptic, I have to challenge my thoughts about there being nothing beyond the physical world and study these things. And here I am, 50 years later, still trying to understand them. After Raymond wrote his book, he got flooded with letters from hundreds and hundreds of people telling about their experiences. And he was an intern at that point and didn't have time to deal with these, so he gave me the letters and said, you do something with them. So I started reading them, and almost every one was similar. They were saying, you mean I'm not the only person this happened to? So we started investigating these cases, talking to these people, interviewing them, trying to find commonalities among the different accounts. About a year later, Raymond had gotten letters from many people who had wanted to study near-death experiences also. And he decided to bring them all to a conference at the University of Virginia to see if he could put our heads together and figure out how to study them collectively. So he did. He collected about a dozen people at the university where we were working. Some of the names you will recognize, maybe Ken Ring, Mike Sabom, John Odette, and about 8 others. And we talked for a weekend about what near-death experiences meant, how we can study them, and out of that became the International Association for Near-Death Studies. We kind of thought that Raymond would be the director of that, but he wanted no part of it. He said, I'm not an organization person, you do it. So he agreed to be honorary president, which meant nothing really. And Ken Ring was president, I was vice president, Mike Sabom was treasurer, and John Odette was secretary. And that was the start of IANDS back around 1979. Shortly after that, I ended up wandering back to Yukon, to the medical school in Farmington. And I came here partly because Ken Ring was there at Storrs, at the main campus, and he had been studying near-death experiences. One of the things that we argued about in those early days of IANDS was whether to start a journal that we could publish information about near-death experiences. And this was really Ken Ring's idea. He thought it would be great. I thought it would be a terrible idea. I said, if you publish our own journal, no one will read it except us. And we need to get the word out to other doctors. So we need to force our researchers to publish in the mainstream journals, not in our private journal. Well, I lost the fight. And he started the journal. It was called, after a few years, the Journal of Near-Death Studies. And after 2 years of it, Ken took a sabbatical from the University of Connecticut to write his second book on NDEs. And he asked me if I would take over the journal for him for that year he was gone. And I agreed. When he came back a year later, he said, I don't think I want to take it back. It's yours. So I edited the journal for the next 27 years. And I must say, it's one of the most rewarding things I've done in my career. Many of the people who published in the journal were senior doctors and scholars in other fields, psychology, sociology, so forth, who could not get published in the mainstream journals in their disciplines. But a lot of the papers, the better ones in fact, were by nursing students and doctoral students who had decided to get interested in NDEs and sent me articles to publish in the journal. And of course, they weren't as polished as the senior doctors were, but I worked with them until they got them of good enough quality to publish in the journal. During that time, we started finding people who had near-death experiences and were having trouble integrating them back into their lives. And being a psychiatrist, I started seeing some of these people in psychotherapy. And it was difficult. And it was partly because they thought I couldn't really understand what they were going through because I hadn't had one. So about this time, Kim Clark in Seattle had started a support group for near-death experiencers and was having great success with it. And I thought we should start that here in Connecticut because maybe talking to each other, the NDEers can help each other deal with these issues. So several of us, there were about 4 of us who got together, 3 of my quote patients, my clients and me, and we decided to form a support group. And since I was working at UConn Health Center, I commandeered a conference room there and said, we're going to meet here once a month in the evening. And we put an ad in the Hartford Courant notifying people that we were having this meeting, and anyone who wanted to join, here's the time and place it happens. We got 30 people the first time, and we consistently have between 20 and 50 people once a month. And as you can see, it's still going strong. And in fact, over the years, various splinter groups broke off. We started out as the only group in Connecticut, and some people came from very far away, from Bridgeport and from the northeast corner. And eventually those other groups formed satellite groups closer to their home. So I started to launch some research at UConn of how to study these near-death experiences. And let me tell you some of the problems we had with that. Near-death experiences are very difficult to study in a rigorous scientific way. First, you have trouble with a biased sample. I started off with people who contacted me saying, let me tell you about my experience. Well, how do we know that those people are like the ones who don't come forward and say, let me tell you about my experience? Are they a different type of NDE? We also have the problem that many near-death experiencers say there are no words to describe my NDE. And then we researchers say, great, tell me about it. So we force them to distort the experience by putting it into words. So we know that they are not telling us literally what happened. They're using whatever metaphors they can come up with that describe to us as close as they can what really happened. An example is that many people describe going through a long, dark, enclosed structure to get from this physical world to some other realm. And here in the US, many people use the word tunnel. I went through a tunnel to get to the other world. Well, I eventually met people who grew up in India and had their NDEs there in the Hindu culture, where they don't have a whole lot of tunnels, or didn't back in the 70s. And they would describe going into a cave or falling through a well or going through the throat of a deep throat of a flower. One person I met in Connecticut was a truck driver who had an NDE in a crash, and he described being sucked into a long tailpipe. So whatever metaphor comes most easily to them, they use to describe what happens to them. This is more graphic with the descriptions of the warm, loving being of light that so many people see. And the image that comes to most people's mind is, this is God in some form. And they will say it's God, some will say it's Christ. People in other cultures don't use those words. They may say it's Krishna, it's Buddha, it's a Yamdu. It was just a being of light. And many people here also just say, I can't put a label on it. It was just this warm, loving being that made me feel protected and welcomed. And in fact, even those that say God will add that saying something like, I'm using that word so you know what I'm talking about, but it wasn't the God I was taught about in church. It's much bigger than that. So, in fact, many will say, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it God, you can call it Allah, you can call it Vishnu, you can call it all there is. All those labels are too puny. It's just out there. You also have the problem that the researchers who were studying this were working in isolation in various parts of the country, eventually various parts of the world, without much support where they were. So they investigated whatever they thought was important about the experience. And some were interested in the way thought processes change during the experience, thoughts getting faster and clearer, having a life review. Others were interested in the emotional aspects of the experience, the feelings of warmth, of love, of cosmic unity. Others were interested in the otherworldly aspects of it, coming into contact with other realms, with other spiritual beings. So we weren't sure whether all these researchers were asking about the same phenomenon. And what one researcher was talking about as an NDE may not have been what another person was talking about. So around 1980, after we'd been doing this for a few years, I decided we needed some consistent protocol for studying near-death experiences. I developed what became the NDE scale. I went through the literature, which was quite sizable by that time, and found the 80 most common features people described in near-death experiences. And I gave these 80 questions or features to a group of near-death experiencers I knew. Ended up being 78 of them, and asked them what they thought of these. And many of them they thought were overlapping, so they ruled some out. And some they thought were just too rare, it almost never happens, and we whittled it down. And then I take the whittled down group, and I gave it to a bunch of researchers and said the same thing. What do you think of these? Tell me which ones are worthwhile and which ones are not. And they whittled it down further. Then I took that and then sent it back to the near-death experiencers and had them do it again. And I went back and forth several times until they came up with 16 items that comprised the scale. And I published that in 1980. Actually, published in 1983 in a mainstream psychiatric journal. And that scale has since then been published into, best translated into 20 different languages, and has been used in over 1,000 studies all around the world. Now, we've learned a lot about near-death experiences since then. So I think the scale needs to be updated. For example, I did not include anything in the scale about unpleasant experiences. We just didn't know about them back then. I didn't include anything in the scale about ineffability. I also didn't include anything about being close to death. I assumed we would only use the scale on people who had been close to death. But since then, people have been using it for other purposes as well. People have been giving the scale to people in their psychedelic drugs trips who just have a vivid dream. And they've used this scale to compare other experiences to NDEs. And I'm not sure whether those are the same experiences or not. They certainly can be profound spiritual changes, mystical experiences that produce long-term spiritual changes. But I'm not sure it's the same as a near-death experience. It might be, but we need to study that. Then there's also problems with establishing that NDEs are real. How do we know that an experience is real? Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's an astronomer in New York and a noted skeptic, says that there's objective truth and subjective truth. And objective truth is something that's the same for everybody. And subjective truth is true only for an individual. And he kind of dismisses near-death experiences as being subjective truth. And I've argued with him about this because NDEs are the same across cultures through the centuries. We have accounts from ancient Greece and Rome that sound like an account you could hear today. People have collected accounts from people natives in Polynesia, in Native Americans. The French fur trappers collected cases in the 1600s that sound just like cases we hear today. We had cases now from Japan, China, India, from Iran, from different religions, different cultures that all sound the same. So I don't think you can call these subjective experiences. They're objectively true. We also know that memories tend to decay over the years. And this is particularly true of memories of events that happen under extreme stress or in extreme emotional states or when you're having drugs on board. And these are things that often happen in NDEs. You're under stress, you're emotional about it, and you may have lots of drugs on board. So we would expect that memories would change over the years. And many of the people who talked to me about their NDEs told me about it years after it happened. So how do we know they're accurate memories? And in fact, many of the debunkers would say, well, of course, they're describing blissful experiences because as the years go on, they remember it more blissfully and more blissfully. It wasn't that way originally, but it eventually becomes that way over the years. So we struggled with that question. Eventually, a psychologist developed a scale to differentiate memories of real experiences from memories of imagined experiences. And she developed this scale to study childhood reports of physical abuse, to see whether they really happened, the abuse really happened, or whether it was imagined. I decided to give that scale to near-death experiencers. And because the scale accurately differentiates memories of real events from memories of imagined events. So I had the near-death experiencers rate their near-death experience on this scale, and also another significant event from the same time of their lives on the scale, and also a memory of an imagined event from the same time of their lives, either a dream or something they had worried about happening that didn't happen, that hoped would happen but didn't happen. And what happened was that the results were quite striking. The memories of near-death experiences looked very much like memories of real events, not at all like memories of false events. But more than that, the memories of NDEs looked more real than memories of real events, which is just what NDEs are telling us, that the NDE was more real than this world is. Several years later, a group in Belgium at the University of Liège and a group at Padua University in Italy repeated this study, and they found the same results. And in fact, the Italian group also measured brainwaves as people were remembering these events. And they said that the brainwaves are similar to brainwaves of people remembering real events, not people remembering false events. So we're pretty confident that the memory is not of a false event, it's of a real event. As for memory decay, I've been doing this for so many years now that I decided around the year 2000 to go back and look at the people that I interviewed around 1980. And I tracked down as many as I could find and interviewed them again and compare what they told me in 1980 with what they told me in 2000. And what I found was there absolutely no difference. They didn't make it more blissful than it was originally. It didn't change in any way. The memories did not change over time. They did not decay. They were not distorted. I also worried about the biased sample that I mentioned before, that people who come to me to talk about their NDEs may not be typical of people who don't come to me. So I started studying a random sample of people who were admitted to the hospital with a cardiac arrest or some other way of coming close to death, to see whether their near-death experiences were the same as those of people who came to me voluntarily. And what I found was that they were basically the same. People who didn't volunteer to come to me, but who I went to and said, what happened when you came close to death? They tended to describe the same things. The difference was that they were not as verbal usually as the ones who came to me voluntarily, which kind of makes sense. If you come to talk about a near-death experience, you do that in part because you got the verbal skills to do it. Whereas a random sample of people in the hospital may or may not have the same level of skills. So I got more detailed cases from people who came voluntarily to tell me about it. But the same phenomena were described by people in the hospital as well. So what did we find? We found dramatic changes in the way people think in the NDE. Their thinking is faster than it is in normal everyday life. It is often described as clearer than it is in normal everyday life. They tend to have enhanced senses. They say their vision and their hearing are sharper than ever. They see colors they'd never seen before. They hear sounds they'd never heard before. And they describe a life review in which their life passes before their eyes. And they describe this often in tremendous detail. They say they can remember things that they weren't aware of at the time it happened. For example, they say I could count the number of mosquitoes around me at that time, and I couldn't then. But now in my life review, I can count them. More striking is in some some life reviews, they experience the events not just from their own perspective, but through the eyes of other people involved. And a dramatic example of this is Tom Sawyer, a fellow from Syracuse, who had his near-death experience in his 30s when a truck he was working under fell and crushed his chest. And he remembered his whole life. And one particular event stood out for him when he was 17 years old, a hot-headed teenager. He was driving his truck downtown, and a drunk man winded out in front of his truck. He almost hit him, but stopped the truck in time. And being an angry, hot-headed teenager, he rolled his window down and started swearing at the man. And the man, unfortunately being drunk, reached in the window and slapped Tom across the face. That was too much for Tom. He came out of the truck and started beating the man senselessly until he left him a bloody heap on the median strip, and then got back in his truck and drove off. Well, he said in his life review, he experienced that from his own perspective and also from the drunk man's eyes. And he said, I could see Tom's face getting redder and redder. I could feel every one of the 32 blows of his fist on my face. I felt my nose getting bloody. I felt my teeth going through my lower lip. I felt the humiliation and the embarrassment, and then I lost consciousness. And Tom felt this from his perspective and from the drunk man's perspective. And I've heard this from many different people about seeing and experiencing the event from other people's lives, through other people's perspectives. And they come away from this with a firm conviction that we are not alone. We're all interrelated somehow. And they describe, like looking at your hand. If you just look at your fingers, they look like they're different, they're separate events. But you look at the whole hand, you see they're really interconnected. They're really part of the same thing. And they say when you come back from a near-death experience like this, you cannot treat other people meanly because you realize what you're doing to them, you're doing to yourself as well. This is basically the golden rule, which is part of every religion that we know. And I think that's because most religions were started by people who had near-death experiences. There's also a sense of timelessness in the near-death experience. And I think this is a little puzzling, it certainly was for me, because people describe their NDEs as a sequence of events. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. But if it's timeless, how can you have a sequence? And yet people say there was no sense of time there, or everything happened all at once, or time didn't exist. And when I ask them, how do you get a sequence of events if there's no time? They say, well, it's a paradox when I tell you right now, back in our brains. But over there, it wasn't a paradox at all. And they can't explain it beyond that. There's also the out-of-body experience that many people have in an NDE when they have a strong sense of leaving the physical body and often looking down on their bodies. Now, neurologists like to say this is a well-known phenomenon called autoscopy. Well, it's not. Autoscopy is being in your body, seeing an image of yourself, a double of yourself out there. And the double does not move around. It's just a static image of yourself, like looking in a mirror, only it doesn't move when you move. In out-of-body experiences, you're not in your body anymore. You're out there looking back at your body. Furthermore, you have, in an out-of-body experience, the possibility of seeing things accurately from that out-of-body perspective. And you don't have that in neurological diseases or in induced OBs, by the way, in like drug trips. But many people report accurately seeing something from this out-of-body perspective, such as the first patient I ever encountered who saw me with my stain on my tie. And we have no way of explaining that. The most dramatic example I have of this is Al Sullivan, who was from East Hartford. He showed up at our Farmington group one day and sat through the whole meeting, smiling and smiling at what people were saying. And then at the end of the meeting, he said, "Can I talk to you privately?" And he told me about his experience. He had been a van driver for Hartford Hospital. And one day on the job, he felt this crushing chest pain. So he called the dispatcher and they told him to come right to the emergency room. He did, and he had blockage on 4 of his major arteries around his heart. So he underwent immediate emergency quadruple bypass surgery. And he said that in the middle of the operation, he left his body and looked down at the operation, and he saw his surgeon flapping his arms like he was trying to fly. At this point, I had been a doctor for about 30 years, and I just couldn't believe this. I had never seen or heard of anybody doing this in an operating room. You don't see doctors on TV doing this. So I assumed that Al was hallucinating because of the anesthesia he was given. And when he told me about this, I said, "Well, are you sure that it was real, that it was not just a hallucination?" And he said, "Well, ask my doctor about it." I said, "Well, have you asked him?" He said, "Yeah, I did." I said, "I saw you flapping your arms. What's that all about?" And he got very angry and said, "Well, I must do something right because you're here, aren't you?" And he left the room. So with Al's permission, I went to talk to the surgeon and asked him about this. And he said, "Yeah, it's true. I've developed this idiosyncratic habit. I've never seen anyone else do it. But I let my assistant start the operation. And while I get gowned and gloved, and I walk in there in my sterile suit, I don't want to touch anything that's not in the sterile field. So I put my hands where I know they won't touch anything. And then I supervise the rest of the attendants by pointing things out with my elbows so I don't touch anything." That's just what Al said. So this can't be dismissed as a lucky guess or an expectation. It's something that was totally unexpected, and yet Al saw it accurately. And we've got case after case of this. Jen Holden from the University of North Texas studied 97 cases of people who claimed to have left their body and seen things around the body. And she found that in 92% of them, they were completely accurate. 6 were mostly accurate, but some mistakes in there. Only 1% was wrong. So it's not just an isolated accurate perception. The vast majority are totally accurate. Well, being a psychiatrist, people often ask me, are these mental illness? And from my observations, it seemed clearly they were not. I saw a lot of people who seemed perfectly healthy who were having these experiences. But being a skeptic, I can't trust my perception, so I have to do a study. So first I studied the incidence of mental illness among people who have NDEs. And I had a large group of them fill out a standard scale of psychiatric symptoms. And what we found was that the incidence was the same as it was for non-NDEers. It didn't cause you to be mentally ill, and it didn't protect you from mental illness. They were the same as anybody else. But that wasn't enough. I also surveyed every patient that came to the UConn Hospital outpatient clinic for a year for psychiatric services, about 800 of them. And I had them fill out a questionnaire that asked, have they ever been close to death? And if they had, I had them fill out my NDE scale. And I found that about 20% of them had a near-death experience. And then I had them fill out a standard scale of psychological symptoms. And we found that those who had an NDE had far fewer symptoms than those people who didn't have NDEs. So it appears that near-death experiencers, or that, put it the other way around, people who come for psychiatric help do not have a high rate of near-death experiences. They have the same rate as everyone else. And those who have NDEs have fewer psychological symptoms than those who don't. So it doesn't seem to be related to mental illness in any way. We've also done lots of experiments to see whether any of the physiological explanations that's been proposed to explain away NDEs hold water. And what we found is that everyone we can test turns out to be contradicted by the data. For example, we thought that originally that a lack of oxygen to the brain causes NDEs. And we've now done studies in the US and the UK and in Germany that show that people who have NDEs actually have more oxygen to the brain than people who don't have NDEs. That suggests that you need an intact functioning brain to have an NDE, or it may just mean that you need an intact functioning brain to be able to remember the NDE. Likewise, we thought that maybe drugs given to patients as they're nearly dying would cause these experiences. And again, we found that people who were given drugs tend to have fewer near-death experiences and less elaborate near-death experiences. So it's not the drugs that are causing the NDE. We've also looked at various parts of the brain that may be involved. There were reports that the right temporal lobe may be involved in a sense of leaving your body. And the data for that caused the people to believe that were really weak. It came from the Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, who back in the 40s mapped out the parts of the brain. And when he stimulated the right temporal lobe, he did that in over 2,000 patients. 2 of them said something vaguely like an out-of-body experience. One said, "I feel almost as if I'm going to leave my body." That's not an OBE. The other one said, "It feels like I'm half here and half not here." Well, that's not an out-of-body experience either. But on the basis of those 2 cases, people have said, well, clearly the right temporal lobe is where these out-of-body experiences are created. So I then did a study again. I looked at patients who came into the hospital with seizure disorders and looked at where the seizure was and whether they had any out-of-body symptoms with their seizures. I found that about 7% of 100 patients has something vaguely like an out-of-body experience. And what I mean by that is they say, "I lost track of where my body was," or "I felt as if I was out of my body." If you ask them, "Were you really out of your body?" they would say, "Of course not, you can't do that." So they clearly didn't have what near-death experiences have. But then I looked at where the lesion was in the brain that was causing their seizures. And they were not in the right temporal lobe. They were all over the place. They were right-handed, right-sided, left-sided, all 4 lobes. There was no correlation between where the seizure was and whether they've had the sense of being out of the body. The most active area of research on NDEs, however, has been with the after effects, because these are the easiest to study. And we find that there's a profound and consistent pattern of after effects, that people basically become more spiritual and less materialistic. They become less concerned with physical things, with things of the material world, with material possessions, power, prestige, fame, competition, and more concerned with the more spiritual things, interpersonal relationships, being caring, compassionate. They act more altruistically. And this is consistent across different cultures. We've done this study in many different cultures now. We also found that this is the same for people who came to the NDE with a religious perspective and those who were total atheists when they had their NDEs. They all become more spiritual. They don't necessarily become more religious. In fact, many will say, "I feel equally at home in any kind of house of worship, or even just out in nature." They can still appreciate the beauty of the rituals, but they tend not to get involved in the dogma of a particular religion. They feel that their God that they met in their NDE was bigger than any one religion's teaching. The biggest question that NDEs raise for most people who haven't had them is, what does this say about life after death? Now, for me as a psychiatrist, I was mostly interested in the after effects because I spent my life trying to help people change their lives, and it's very, very hard to do. And here's this experience that in a few seconds can totally transform someone's attitudes, values, beliefs, behavior forever. And by the way, we've also studied how long-lasting these effects were. And again, I looked at people that I studied back in the 70s and 80s, and I re-interviewed them today. And again, the after effects were just as strong now as they were back then. They don't go away. We've also found that the after effects are not limited to the experiencer, him or herself, but it's also the people who learn about near-death experiences can experience some of the same changes. Ken Ring at UConn in Storrs used to teach a course in NDEs to his students. And 2 different years, he gave the students attitudinal tests before the class started and at the end of the semester, and then again a year later. And he found that the students became much more compassionate and caring in the course of the one semester, and that continued for a year afterwards. That was repeated at the Miami University, where he actually measured people's behavior and found that the students became more altruistic. They volunteered more. It was repeated with a group of nursing students, and there was even one high school class in Ohio where one of the teachers had a near-death experience and wanted to teach her students about it. And she found that they became more compassionate up to a year after the course was over. Now, there are some unpleasant experiences and some unpleasant after effects. As you, I'm sure, know, that it's not easy to come back into a normal everyday life after a near-death experience sometimes. And I've seen people have to change their careers. Sometimes I've seen relationships break up. Steve Price, who lived in Connecticut and was part of this Farmington group at one point, he was a high school bully, and his career goal was to become a Marine. He did. He went to Vietnam. He was a sergeant in Vietnam and got shot in the chest and had bullet fragments throughout his lungs. He was air evac to a hospital in the Philippines, and during the operation to clean up his lungs, he had a near-death experience. And he came back from that experience totally changed. He, of course, was sent back when he recovered to Vietnam and found that he could not shoot his gun. The idea of killing somebody else was just unthinkable to him. So he ended up leaving the Marines, coming back to the States, and retraining to be a medical technician. And we've seen that again and again. Joe Gerasi, who was a policeman in New Britain, had an NDE when he bled out after a routine operation. And he again had a blissful experience and came back unable to shoot somebody. So he left the police force, went back to college, and trained to become a high school teacher. And we see this again and again. People in violent professions or in cutthroat businesses end up going into healthcare, social work, teaching, clergy, something that helps people rather than hurts people. I was going to talk about the afterlife. I forgot about that. Many people in an NDE report encountering deceased loved ones. And the debunkers can dismiss this as wishful thinking and just expectation. You think you're going to die, so you imagine being united with deceased loved ones. Sure, easy to explain away. But there are a number of cases where people see someone who is dead, but they thought they were still alive. So there was no expectation of seeing them. And we have examples of this going back to the ancient times. Pliny the Elder in the 1st century wrote about a case like this. The most dramatic one in my collection was a fellow who was, when he's 25 years old, he was hospitalized with pneumonia. And he repeatedly had respiratory arrests where he would stop breathing. And there was one particular nurse he was very fond of who told him one day, she's going to take a long weekend off and you're not going to see me for a while. So he wished her well, she went off. And while she was gone, he had another respiratory arrest, had to be resuscitated. And during that period, he had an NDE. And he found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene, and there was his nurse, Anita. He was startled, so he said to her, Anita, what are you doing here? And she said, this is my home now, but you can't stay here. You have to go back to your body. And I want you to tell my parents that I'm very sorry that I wrecked the red MGB. And then she turned and walked away. He then woke up in his hospital bed, resuscitated, and he told the first nurse who came into his room about this NDE. And she started crying and left the room. And later he learned that his nurse, Anita, had in fact taken the weekend off because it was her 21st birthday, and her parents came into town to celebrate with her. And they surprised her for her birthday with a red MGB. And she excitedly got in the car, took off, drove too fast, lost control of the car, smashed into a telephone pole, and died instantly, a few hours before he had his near-death experience. Now, there's no way he could have known she was dead. He wasn't expecting her to be dead, and no way he could have known how she died, and yet he did. So does this prove that people survive death? It certainly suggests that something about us, about our consciousness, continues after our bodies die that can still communicate with the living here. So I think the takeaways from this are, number one, that we learned that near-death experiences are tremendously common experiences. We found that between 10 and 20% of people whose hearts stop will report NDEs, and there may be more who don't report them to us. That amounts to about 5% of the general population, 1 out of 20 people. So someone in your family, someone in your class, someone in your workplace has probably had a near-death experience. We've also learned that they're not associated with mental illness. There's nothing abnormal about these experiences. These are normal things that happen to normal people under abnormal conditions. We've also learned that these experiences have a tremendous impact on people's lives. And the most common feature in the after effects is a complete loss of fear of death. People are no longer afraid of dying. When I first heard that, I was worried that this is going to make people suicidal if they learn about this, because being afraid of death is what stops many people from killing themselves. So, of course, I did a study. I looked at patients who came into the hospital with a suicide attempt, and I compared those who had a near-death experience as a result of the suicide attempt with those who didn't. And the ones who had an NDE were much less suicidal than those who didn't have an NDE. And when I asked them about this, they said things like, if you lose your fear of dying, you also lose your fear of living. You're not afraid of taking chances, of living to the fullest, because you're not afraid of losing life. You know what's coming later is even better. So you're free to engage in life to the fullest extent and get the most you can out of it. And life becomes much more meaningful and fulfilling than it was before. It also suggests that the way we think about the mind and brain is wrong. We usually think that the mind is what the brain does. All our thoughts are created by the brain. If that were true, then when the brain stops, you could not have a near-death experience. People describe in the NDE the most vivid experience they've ever had, while the brain is not able to formulate an experience. So we have evidence from near-death experiences that these are tremendously powerful, profound events that change people's lives forever and raise serious questions about what we thought we knew about the mind and the brain and about life and death. It certainly affected me. I know that I don't think about death the way I used to. That's just the ending. I'm fairly convinced that there's something out there after we die. I don't know what it is because I don't think people are telling me literally what happened to them. I think they gave me metaphors of what happened. But I'm pretty sure that whatever it is, it's not something to be afraid of. That's made my life a lot easier. I'm also a lot more comfortable with the unknown, with not having to have all the answers. So let me wrap up that point and ask if you have questions to which I don't have answers.
Okay, we're open for Q&A. So if you want to speak, you have to turn on your microphone, and we'll start with there. What's going on? Okay.
I'll talk. Hello? Oh, never mind.
Laurie, did you have a question?
Yes, Jack, I have a question for Dr. Greyson.
Go ahead.
Dr. Greyson, hi, my name is Lori Beniisa, and I found your the group that you founded in Farmington. After I died from toxic mold exposure in my home, drove to the emergency room. They didn't at UConn. They didn't believe me that I was sick and I died from mold. And I was asking for the environmental specialists, and they surrounded my car when I tried to leave and shot me with Halidol and Ativan and put me in the psychiatric ward.
Yeah.
And so I got out in 2 days because they called my doctor and said, yes, she's sick and dying from mold, and my allergist. And had a probate lawyer. And so I did see the environmental specialist, Paula Schenk, and Dr. Moore at UConn. And I have a letter stating I can't be in moldy or water damaged buildings and exposed to uh, toxic mold. And I had a very brief NDE. It was very, very brief. I went to a black void that was velvety, thick. I knew I didn't have to breathe, and I was just trying to figure out where I was. And so I found the group by Googling on YouTube and found Tina Angeli, who has recently wrote her book on We Are Angels, which is wonderful. And I met Jack and Tina and joined the group since I think it was 2018 that I joined. And a lot of the things you say that I'm grateful for all your studies and making awareness of this. And one concept I've had a difficult time grasping that I don't know if you could explain in any more detail is the concept of time, that everything on the other side that people experience is not linear. It's happening all at the same time.
Yeah.
And once again, I just want to say thank you so much for your work. I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I'm happy to be here tonight.
Thank
And
you, Laurie.
actually, I'm in the hospital. I'm at Hartford
Oh,
Hospital right now.
oh my gosh.
I had an issue, and I've been here for about 5 days, but I'm doing well.
Yeah. Laurie, let me ask you, what year was it that you had your first experience where they sent you to the psychiatric hospital?
It was December 3rd, 2017.
Okay. I'm a little surprised at that because I thought they would be more enlightened by now. I'll tell you, when we first started doing this research back in the early 80s, no doctors had heard about this. And it was very common for patients to be told, we'll have a psychiatrist come evaluate you.
They did that.
But they were told just, it's the drugs, forget about it, it'll go away.
Mhm.
Of course, it doesn't go away. But now most doctors know about it. And most doctors, most places, will not treat you like a psychiatric patient. They will probably call someone in who knows about NDEs to work with you.
They didn't call in the environmental specialist or an NDE person. They just felt that it was appropriate to knock me out and lock me away.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about that. That's still going on.
Well, my goal is to try and do something about that. So I may reach out to you afterwards.
Great. IANDS, the central IANDS, is doing a lot of education now with doctors and nurses. They have programs that they take around the country educating people about this. And in fact, there have been several good books in recent years by doctors telling about their own near-death experiences.
Yes.
Evan Alexander, Mary Neal, Tony Sicaria, there's lots of them now about doctors sharing their own NDEs, which I think is expanding the knowledge among physicians as well.
Yes. So Tina in this group sent me a resource of that. I think it was today.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that may be useful.
Yeah. You ask about the timelessness, and I don't know that I have an answer for that.
I can't wrap my head around it, no matter how hard I try.
Yeah, I can't either. But it's reported not only in NDEs, but in many mystical experiences. Sometimes it's happened with psychedelic drugs as well. But certainly in a lot of the religious spiritual traditions that create mystical experiences through sensory deprivation or various other techniques. And they describe it in various ways because it's hard to put it into words. But some say, I knew there was time back on Earth, but there wasn't time there. Or time didn't move in a linear fashion the way it does on Earth. Or there just wasn't any time there. But they say, I really can't tell you what it was like because, as I said before, there were events happening and yet they weren't happening in time. So it's hard to understand that. I know that. Yeah.
I think the one thing I listen to, a lot of NDEs on videos or read stories.
Yeah.
And one person described it as he was like, if I was there on the other side, I would be Lori Ing. So he said I was Raymond Ing,
Right.
that it was just a verb of being, a constant state of being. So that's as close as I've come. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of them say that the sense of linear time we have is something that we have imposed on our minds to explain how things happen here in the physical world, but it's not necessary when you're not in the physical world.
Right, right. Okay, thank you very much.
Jack, wasn't there a list of people that signed up ahead of time to ask questions?
Yes, those will be after we have addressed the Q&A concerning Grayson's presentation.
Thank you.
I just want to give a very quick. I want to give a very quick shout out to Bruce. This is Narasimhan Srinivasan from the business school. And I used to come there with Ken Ring about 30 years ago, if you remember me.
Yes,
Very nice to see you. I'm wearing my Ian's shirt.
Oh, yes.
Maria Beatriz has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. Hello. And Bruce, I love the talk. I'm here with my mom, and I have two questions.
Yes.
So the first question is about what you said about how the relationships change after somebody has a near-death experience. I haven't had any, sorry. So I'm I wonder if you have studied the rate of divorce after the near-death experience. Is it equal to the general population, less, more? What is it about it? And then the other question I have is, I suppose there are people that have had near-death experiences and also have had psychedelic trips.
Yes, yes.
So what do they say about what is equal or different?
Okay, yeah.
And I thank you so much for
Sure.
everything.
Yeah. Well, let me take the psychedelic drugs question first, because that's the easier one to answer. If you look at the way people describe NDEs and the way they describe psychedelic drug trips, you can find a lot of similarities, and they seem as if they're the same phenomenon. But people who've had both tell me it's not the same thing at all. It's like asking someone who's been in combat to describe what he saw and heard and felt in the middle of battle. And then asking someone who was watching a movie about war what he saw and felt and heard during the movie. And they may use a lot of the same words to describe it, but nobody would confuse the two and think that watching the movie is the same as being actually in battle. One is just a mimic of the other. And they say that's what the drug experience is like compared to the NDE. You have to use the same words because there's so many words you can use, but it's not a real experience the way the NDE is. In fact, there was a neuropsychiatrist named Carl, just flew out of my head. He was from New Zealand, and he was promoting the theory that ketamine is the cause of the NDE, that ketamine produced in the brain causes NDEs. And he experimented with ketamine himself, taking ketamine to produce an experience like this. And he talked about this, wrote about it in medical journals for about a dozen years, and that he had a near-death experience himself. He had a heart attack, his heart stopped, he had a near-death experience. And he said, oh man, that's not the same thing at all. It's totally different. Now, the question about divorce is tricky because many people reported high rates of divorce among near-death experiencers, but there's also a hugely high rate of divorce among non-NDEers as well. So it becomes hard to say how much more divorces there are in NDEers than among other people. And some people have reported that there are a lot. Nancy Bush, when she was at Storrs, did a study of this, and she found that there was a higher rate among NDEers. I have not found that in my research. I found about the same rate. But what we do find is that the reasons why people get divorced are different among families with an NDE. Among the general population, the questions that cause people to get divorced are usually arguments about how money is spent, or how the children are raised, or sexual issues. And among NDE families, it's usually because the NDEer wants to change his or her lifestyle and become more altruistic and more compassionate, and the spouse isn't able to tolerate that. And that's what is often the cause of the divorce in NDE families. Kim Clark, who's a social worker in Harborview Hospital in Seattle, tells a great story about she knew a couple who were both basic scientists in the medical school, a biochemist and a pharmacologist. And the woman had a near-death experience. I don't remember how it happened, but she had an NDE. And she had a beautiful experience, and Kim was her social worker. And she said to Kim, I want to tell my husband about this, but he's a diehard materialist, and I'm sure he would not want to hear this. So would you sit with me while I explain it to him? Because I'm afraid he'll leave me if he hears I have this bizarre thing. I'm crazy. So Kim met with the two of them, and she starts telling him about the NDE. And she's got her eyes looking down because she doesn't want to make eye contact with him. And she tells him all about the NDE. And partway through, Kim stops her and says, look at him. His mouth is hanging way open. And his eyes are wide. And Kim stops and says to the husband, what's going on with you? What are you feeling? And he said, I had an experience just like this 10 years ago. And I was afraid to tell her about it. So we see that very commonly, that people just don't want to talk about the NDE. They're afraid they will be ridiculed or thought crazy.
Thank you. That
Yeah.
amazing. Thank you.
Dr. Greyson, Indora Chavarias has her hand up, followed by John Pritko and then Susan Leeser. So Indora.
Good.
Oh, I'm really sorry. That was a mistake. I'm enjoying this. I didn't really have anything to say, but thank you.
Okay. Thank you. John Pritko.
Good evening, Dr. Greyson. How are you doing?
There you go. Good.
First off, I enjoyed the show. You were up pretty early in the morning, Thursday morning, I believe it was, with Coast to Coast.
Oh, yes. Gosh, you were up that late, huh?
No, I subscribed to the show, so I listened to it during the day. And one of the topics you talked about on that show, which I don't think you talked about tonight, was those folks that attempted suicide.
Yes, yes.
You mentioned that if they live alone and they have no hope, then they won't come out well. But I think the bigger question is, did you study or did you ask them, those that recovered, if they had an NDE?
I asked those. Yeah, I did study those who had an NDE as a result of the attempt. Mm-hmm. And they did not have any suicidal thoughts afterwards. And this was striking because we know that about 5% of people who make a suicide attempt will repeat in the next 5 years.
Oh.
And the near-death experiences did not. Now, that's not to say that no NDEer ever becomes suicidal, because some, especially in the first couple of years, have such difficulty integrating back into the normal world and being accepted by their peers, by their family, that they find this life almost intolerable. And the allure of the other world seems too great for them, and this world seems too painful. So there are occasional ones who do become suicidal. I don't know if any that has taken his or her life, but they do think about that idea.
And my last question on a different topic is, you also talked about how you don't have to end up in a traumatic event to experience a NDE. There's other ways, such as meditation. What type of meditation were you talking about?
I wasn't being specific. Almost any type of meditation can do it. And what I was saying was that the near-death situation is not the only way of having a profound mystical experience. It's just one of the most reliable ways in our current culture. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Yep.
People have been trying to do this type of thing for centuries. But one of the ways that NDEs are different is that people aren't trying to have an NDE. You know, when you're involved in a spiritual practice or a meditation, you are trying to achieve it, and you often have a guide helping you interpret it to you. Whereas an NDE happens to you unwanted usually, and there's no one there to help you get through it. So you're really taken by surprise and left to explain it to yourself, which makes it much more difficult to deal with.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks thanks for being here. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else?
Susan Leeser has her hand up, followed by Sue Maizano.
There you are.
Hello?
Yes.
I don't think I had a near-death experience, but I had several out-of-the-body experiences to where I was floating up above, and I was trying to get my brothers and my sister's attention. I'm saying, I'm up here. Can't you see me? I'm right here. And they couldn't see me. And I kept thinking, well, am I dead or what's going on? But I never could ever figure out what that meant. I know just I was in an orphanage. We got separated from my brothers and sisters. And I just kept having these dreams over and over that where I would go and try to talk to them, but they couldn't see or hear me. And I couldn't figure out why they couldn't see or hear me.
Yeah. So these happen during sleep?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fairly common that people have dreams of leaving the body or of flying. And those are associated with often with other mystical experiences, but not always.
Yeah. I've had several other things happen too.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had dreams of flying too.
Yeah.
I turned around. I was driving to my daughter's one day, and I turned around and looked up in the rear view mirror, and my sister had passed away several years before that, and she was sitting in my back seat, and smiling, had a really big smile on her face, and I said, "Oh!"
Yeah.
And I guess I scared her off. I shouldn't have got so excited, but it was her. She was solid. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, that's dangerous when you're driving.
Yeah. Yeah. But it was real. I mean, I saw it. I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
And then this other thing that happened to me was my boyfriend's mother died, and she came to me in a dream, and she was all dressed in black, and she even had a black veil over her face. And maybe 3 or 4 days later, my boyfriend's grandson, 24 years old, died. And I believe I had, what do you call it, a visitation where it just seemed so real. It was just so real. And I believe she came to collect Cody soul to help him transition over. I mean, do you have any explanation of something else or what could have happened?
No,
what would you call that?
People often in near-death experiences see someone that seems to be coming to help them make the transition. That's fairly common.
It was so real.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's all.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Anyone else?
Yeah, I raised my hand. Oh, okay. Hi, Dr. Greyson. I love the stories you shared. So much detail and very in-depth studies. I was a neurobiologist before. I worked as a postdoc in UConn for a few years. I wasn't aware of studies like this until I joined the group. So I'm now into meditation and healing. So I know the NDE is real, and the experience is so deep, so personal. I just want to recreate that in meditation. Like I don't know exactly how the script should go to guide people to have the same similar experience, that spiritual awakening experience, so that they don't have to go through taking some drugs or trying to kill themselves in order to have a profound change in their life, a permanent change. So that's my idea, is to use meditation. Another thing is because I believe what experienced by the NDE experiencers is available to everybody. It's just finding the means to achieve that. And also because when people in the near-death experience, they have they can see beyond their body, they can travel, they can see you, you're in another room. So that's also indicates remote viewing is possible. If people can get themselves achieve that state on demand by some type of meditation, then they can do remote viewing because they can also feel other people's feelings. These sort of things are all possible. Have you ever studied healers or people who have some spiritual abilities that have similar experiences like the near death?
We have. Yeah. And we're actually studying meditators now to look at the spontaneous experiences they have during meditation that were of a mystical nature. People that try to design a guided meditation to help people have an NDE. And it's difficult because the NDEs are so individualized, so personalized. So if you start telling somebody, now you're going to have your life review, or now you're going to see something, it's not going to be applicable to everybody. So you can't really do them. So what people often do is provide some just relaxation.
Yeah.
Or sometimes using music to help them get into an altered state and then allow the experience to develop on its own.
Yeah, that reminds me of there's a type of hypnosis called life between life hypnosis.
Yes.
Have you heard of it?
Yes.
Okay. So that is the closest I have seen to achieve to a similar state as NDE, where they go actually beyond that. They go to the spirit world to, see their soul groups, their the higher realms of the spirit world. So that's the book that I saw that describe the deepest of in that nature.
Yes. Yeah.
So it is. I guess it's possible.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue and Dr. Greyson. We have three more people with hands up. Lou Aiello, followed by Rob, and then James Clement. So Lou, do you want to?
Yes, Dr. Greyson, I was kind of, the answer's been kind of answered, but what my question was, what do you think of relating meditation? Like if you, like what was just talked about was that I feel that would have clarity and understanding in NDEs by the meditation. And it's like doing a study of what the Buddha concepts are, of getting to understand, we can understand more, and then within that, it's complex because we're all from different places with different cultures, different experiences, different understandings and everything. Right. And then that is a given, and that's exactly all part of it. But in the meditation, I think it would be a huge help for your extensive study of the meditation, because I meditate every day, and knowing about the body, the speech, and the mind, and the interaction of it, of when to do things and when not to do things, is so important. And the senses, working with your senses, you can get to know and understand a lot. But the trauma is this world will tell us tunnel vision, to do things a certain way only. And there's so many different understandings.
Sure.
And to be able to look at that, and you completely see different, and then our body and everything else changes. So sometimes what we know, what we get familiar to is good to do, but another time it's not good to do. But if you, within all your studies, to help people, to give them that understanding that we have to be more complex beyond the given identity that we have, which would be a big help. And I was just wondering what you thought about what I just mentioned.
Yeah. Most of the research that's been done with meditation in this country is done with some type of mindfulness meditation. And there are many different varieties, but the goal is to increase your state of mindfulness, of paying more attention to what's actually going on second by second. And I think that helps you get in touch with your inner states, including near-death experiences. I think there are probably some people who, in a near-death situation, are too frightened to go into a near-death experience, and they can actually stop themselves from having one by not paying attention to it. And if you really get involved in paying attention to what's going on with your body, with your mind, minute by minute, you're more likely to be able to understand and to appreciate what's going on with you. That's true of everyday life as well as with your dream states and with your near-death experience.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Greyson. And thank you, Lou, for that question. I think we'll do 2 more questions, and then I know Jack has some questions that people sent in previously. So if you don't mind, Rob has his hand up, and then James Clement Van Pelt.
Hello, Dr. Greyson. I'm over here. Listen, I'm experienced. I had an NDR, and years later I had an STE, which I think probably was precipitated by my initially having my near-death experience. But one of the interesting things I had for me, if your studies show it out, my near-death experience later on came back as a witness to it. And I didn't understand during my NDE why this was happening, but I was shown things that very bright colors, very, very bright green, very, very bright reds that I didn't recognize. Because here's the reason why. I'm what you call profoundly colorblind.
Ah.
And so a couple of years ago, my wife got me a pair of sunglasses that showed red. And they had that spectrum on there. And I said, whoa, what color is that? Because I don't know the colors. I could tell their difference, but I never learned the colors. And so one of our meetings that we're facilitating, that they said, was it super or supra? Is this even a super or supra event? And I said, it would have to be super because I cannot, of my own body, create color vision in me. And I didn't realize at the time, I can say within my near-death, I was specifically shown these that I said I'd never seen colors like this before. And then coming back, so it was years later, this validation that whatever happened at that point was not a mystical or my mind working on me. Now people can go back and say that's retrospective falsification, of course. All right, and I fully understand that because I was a clinical social worker for 25 years. I understand that but that color, it slipped my mind until those glasses and until it was brought up, and I went, wow. So don't wonder, do other people report during their near-death experience later on something comes back to validate it?
Sometimes that does happen. There are people who were born blind, who have never been able to see, and in the near-death experience, they seem to be able to see things, and they can describe colors. And I don't know how they even know what a color is, but they do, and they are accurate. They're correct. There was one fellow who was he had lost his hearing by a grenade went off near his ear, and he had no hearing. And in his near-death experience, he heard perfectly. So these things do come back.
Thank you.
Okay, and our last question right now is James Clement Van Pelt.
Hi, James.
Hey, Bruce. Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Okay, it's nice to see you this way. I wanted to ask you, when I spoke to your group at UVA, I was taking off from the work done at University of Michigan dealing with this weird thing that happens at the very moment before terminal heart attack, where the brain goes into what I call a brain flash. It's highly ordered, highly comprehensive. And so basically what I did from there was to build sort of a model that would accommodate that phenomenon. And it leads away from a physicalist interpretation of things. And I know that's been a great part of your struggle, is to the fact that the physicalist model is so dominant. It's such a paradigm. And so I wanted to ask you, has work been done to develop an alternative model that would accommodate NDE and the other phenomena that we talked about tonight? It's not going to be as detailed as the physical model is, but has work been done on that? Because I haven't heard that much about that topic.
Yeah, Ed Kelly and his group have published a book called Beyond Physicalism. It's an edited book with 12 different chapters by people with different models of how to accommodate the concept of a mind separate from the brain and how it interacts with the brain. And some of them are physical models involving multiple dimensions, that type of thing. And others are psychological models based on a archetype idea or other psychological ideas. But they're all more or less metaphoric conceptions. They're not concrete the way a physicalist model can be. So I'm not sure how helpful they can be in terms of really understanding what's happening. They can give you ways of talking about what's happening that don't involve physicalism. But the problem with the physical models is, after all this research we've been doing on the brain, we still have no idea of how a physical event, an electrical or chemical process in the brain, can produce a thought or a perception. And we just can't get over that barrier. So we have a problem with the physical idea that we have no way of explaining how that can create a thought. But we also have a problem with the idea of a separate mind. We have no way of understanding how the mind interacts with the physical body. So both models have what seem to be insurmountable problems with them, which suggests to me as we're asking the wrong question. If the question doesn't have an answer, maybe it's not a valid question. So I don't know how to explain that. But there is work being done on trying to pursue it from both angles, both sides. But I don't think they're getting very far. One of the problems with the physical models is they just show correlations and not causations. And this is a problem, for example, with the psychedelic drug research. We show that when you're giving these people drugs, they have this experience that seems to be mystical and profound spiritual experience. And we used to think that it was because the psychedelic drugs stimulate the brain to hallucinate. And the research done in the last decade at Johns Hopkins and at Imperial College in London is showing the opposite, that these psychedelic drugs, when they produce spiritual experiences, they tend to have lower electrical activity in the brain and less coordinated electrical activity. So it's as if the brain is getting out of the way, and the drugs kind of dampen this filtering process and lets the full consciousness flower.
I think one step toward the model that you're talking about is to realize that between sensations, physical sensations, and mental ideation, there's a missing step.
Yes.
And that step has to be partly physical and partly ideational. And basically, we have a name for that function, which is the heart. The heart is partly physical and partly, when we have heartache or broken heart, whatever, there's mental content to that also. So there's something in between body and mind that's making that transition in terms of the information going each way.
Right. We are physical and we are also spiritual. And if you just look at one part of us, you don't understand the whole person. You have to look at both parts, really.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Greyson. I wanted to turn this over to our esteemed host, Jack Lardis. Jack, you seem to be muted.
I'm
There you
muted. We have a number of questions or topics that were raised by some of the members. And Rob Say had the first one. Rob, would you like to read your question? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Jack. No, you go ahead and read it. You have it in front of you. I don't have
Okay.
the wording exactly, so go ahead, please.
All right. The question, what Rob is asking is, are there any biological indicators that may deduce one to think that these events, NDEs, STEs, etc., are anomalies driven by a biological marker rather than an indicator of possible life after death?
I don't know of any. We've looked at many different biological markers that we thought might be good candidates for this, and we haven't found one. That doesn't mean we never will, but we haven't found one yet. All the ones that have been suggested are either shown to be false, like oxygen deprivation, or are basically untestable. For example, people have proposed that maybe a chemical such as DMT is produced in the brain at the time of death that creates these mystical experiences. And that is, I guess, a plausible idea, but we can't measure something like DMT produced in the brain as someone is dying. The chemicals like endorphins produced under stress in the brain are produced in very, very small amounts for a very short period of time. And we don't even know where in the brain to look for these chemicals. So it's virtually impossible to do a study where you actually measure the chemical as someone is going through a dying process. So they're theoretical ideas that really can't be tested. But even if we found a biological marker that would not establish causation, for example, as you're listening to me talk right now, there's electrical activity in your temporal lobe. Does that mean that the activity in your temporal lobe is causing my voice, creating my voice? I don't think so. So it may be that the chemical marker, the biological marker is causing the event, or it may be a result of the event, or it may be just a coincidence that it always occurs with it.
Okay. Did that answer your question?
Well, it did to
All
a
right.
degree. I was more interested in the real quick, the DNA process that we do, the strands, the helix, and all that. Would there possibly be something within the DNA, the individuals, uniquely to them that would permit such events to happen versus those who have similar near-death physical consequences without the experience?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about 23andMe and Ancestry.com right now. If you threw that out there, how many of you had an NDE? And then look at the DNA and see if there's anything along that spectrum.
Well, that's a plausible idea, because we know that mystical experiences in general sometimes run in families. And that may be a genetic thing, and maybe just be a cultural thing in certain families. We've actually been toying with the idea of studying the genome of people who have experiences like NDEs. It's not very easy to get hospital permission to do a study like that. But looking at the crude markers that you get in 23andMe probably isn't going to be enough. I think you need to look specifically at the genes that code for neurotransmitter receptors, that type of thing, which you'd need a specialized lab to do. And again, what you find, if you do find something there, is a marker, not necessarily a cause. It may be that you need a certain genetic makeup to allow this thing to happen. It doesn't cause it, but allows it to happen.
Okay, Rob. All right. We had a question from Charlie Woolsey. Charlie, are you here? Microphone on, Charlie? I don't see him. Okay. All right, let me go to Linda Clayton. Linda, are you here? Hello. Okay. Well, let me ask my question.
Yeah.
All right. Over the years, I've recorded or made notes about hundreds of NDEs through our group in Yukon. And I've found that the majority of the experiencers describe their experience with beings that are recognizable. They see their relatives, or they see figures that they refer to as godlike, etc. But they're based on images like with sense. Then there's a small percentage that have their experience where they encounter beings of light or orbs of light or energy. And so not people that they're familiar with. And I wonder, is the mind, is the brain making that conversion like we do when we look at something? Actually, the image in our retina is upside down, but the mind automatically makes that adjustment. So I'm just trying to see if really the common denominator of beings on the other side are beings of light and energy, and the mind in most of the cases make the change because it's more comfortable and it's easier to describe.
Yeah. I think that is the case. I think a lot of people encounter beings or entities on the other side that we don't have words for, we don't have a way of describing them. There's no counterpart in the earthly world. So when you come back here and try to understand it, you have to use whatever models you come up with. And some people may use models of deities or angels. Some people may use models of aliens. It depends partly on your religious background and your cultural background, what words you have available to you to use these to describe these things. And it seems like when you're in the other realm, these questions don't arise. You just relate to this other entity, and that's fine. But when you're back inside your brain needs to make sense of it somehow, and it imposes these models, the images on it, which in a way distorts it, but allows you to communicate and think about it. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure.
Well, yes. Is there a word that describes that transfer that the mind makes?
I'm not sure. I have no word for that.
I've been looking for it for a long time.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know what happened to Charlie. Charlie Woosley asked the question, how many NDEs involve a spiritual being, and how does it differ between religious cultures and with atheists?
I would say that well more than half of NDEs involve some type of spiritual being. And the way people describe that certainly comes from the language of their culture and their religion. Even atheists are familiar with the language of the religions in their countries. For example, atheists here in the US know the word God, they know the word Christ, they know the word angel, so they can use those words if they encounter them. Now, sometimes
Hello?
It appears that Dr. Greyson's video is frozen. He may have had an interruption in his service.
Okay, what can we do, Bethany?
I'm really not sure. But I'll pause the recording now, and hopefully he'll be able to come back in a minute.